All right, we're back. Casey Green again, and I'm happy to welcome my guest, Lou Pugliese. Lou is, as I mentioned earlier, awaiting his arrival. He's the Senior Innovation Fellow at Arizona State University. Lou, I've already introduced you to the audience while waiting for you to arrive in terms of Moodle Rooms, Blackboard. I didn't add that at one point of Vice President of ETS. But now you're on the inside. A university affiliation, for the record, you're kind of wearing a pseudo tweed jacket as opposed to a dark suit. What does it mean to be the Innovation Fellow, the Senior Innovation Fellow, not just an Innovation Fellow at Arizona State University?
Well, the truth is that I'm not sure exactly what an Innovative Fellow is, but I was tasked with the responsibility of developing a research lab at ASU. And, it's interesting. You get to understand the science behind how learning happens and, an incredible intellectual capital that's within a university. So that's really been enjoyable and a great learning experience for me. Some universities are obviously difficult in terms of time and speed and agility.
I'm sorry, universities don't respond quickly?
Well, they don't necessarily work with speed.
Yeah.
There is some bureaucracy there, but I think Michael Crow, the unique thing about Michael, as everyone has heard, is that he's extremely creative.
We should say Michael Crow is the president of ASU.
Yes.
Okay.
So Michael, has
and he will be joining us tomorrow.
Yes. Yeah. So that's great, and you'll get to hear his opinion about how he reshapes the new American university, as he says it. And so there's very little barriers in my particular division, Ed Plus. It's been really incredible because it's very entrepreneurial. There are really no rules. It looks like a startup in education. Everybody's in kind of a mosh pit working together on a number of different projects, some of which, are long-standing ASU Online, some of which are recent Starbucks-like projects that are very entrepreneurial.
Let's clarify. The Starbucks project is the alliance that was announced last year between ASU and Starbucks in terms of trying to assist those Starbucks employees who may have started college to complete their degrees online through ASU, right?
Correct. That's absolutely correct.
Okay. So I want to come back. Actually, before I get a little bit of housekeeping, I'll remind the audience, I believe we've got about 60 or 70 people online with us. This is an interactive environment, so you can either ask questions in terms of the text box, raise your hand. We are monitoring the questions from the audience. You mentioned learning science. I worked in universities, you have worked with universities and clients, and now you're on the inside. There's a lot of epiphany and opinion, and often there's not a lot of evidence in our conversations about learning and instruction. You're not on the other side of that. You're not representing a firm that's bringing a technology or a resource. You're, as you said, sort of in the lab and helping to go a little further. Talk with us about that experience in terms of the quest for evidence in learning science.
Yeah, so most of the research that we found when I first got to ASU at Plus is that the learning science was very incidental in nature. In other words, they took a course, they did a program, they studied that one course over a period of time, and then they moved on to something else, right? So the difference with what we're trying to do here with the Action Lab is to make it persistent and create a dedicated laboratory environment studying deep learning science. And that means that, moving from just studying administrative analytics, which are important, how students enter into a course, don't enter in a course, how they persist, and just transactional data versus what are they learning inside an online environment in particular, and how are they learning specifically, and how does one student differ from another? And that is an ongoing process in the research that gets fed back into the instructional design loop so that we can continue to improve our programs.
So I want to take an example from the pharmaceutical industry. I think you and I have talked about this a couple of times. If you think about all the great claims that have been made for technology in terms of transforming education, if we were in a heavily regulated industry like pharmacology, there is a very precise testing and assessment metric. You can't make a claim that this new wonder drug or this new medical procedure is going to do something without really bringing forward a lot of evidence and getting FDA approval. Not so much in education, in that process.
Yeah.
How's that going to change? How does it need to change?
Well, I think what's interesting is that today, even as early as 3 years ago, the access to data and data systems have accelerated at a phenomenal pace. So we can do a lot more than what we used to be able to do. So in a day and age where you can map the human genome or you can do gene splicing for stem cell, Can we do this for education? Well, I had to say no 5 years ago. Today, I think we're in a position now, if we structure our systems correctly, where we can really get into the deep learning science and look at it like a clinical trial, and so I think there's a real strong ability for us to take a much deeper dive.
But I think the pushback on that, because so many people come into education not because it's high tech or because it seems like it's a lab, but it's because it's high touch in one sense. You got to think about particularly college faculty. It's work I used to do in a prior career. You look at folks who become college professors. People don't go to college to become a college professor. It's a recruited career. You look at the data from UCLA's freshman survey. It's the best data we have, several 100,000 students a year going back 5 decades. Maybe 0.1% of students say, I want to go to college to be a college professor. Somebody touches you metaphorically and says, not just be an engineer, but be an engineering professor or be a biology professor as opposed to study biology. What happens to the high touch side in terms of that process when learning science as opposed to the high touch becomes the motivation or sort of changes the tone and tenor of some of the conversation?
Yeah, so there's a lot of answers to that question and having more thought, but I can tell you one thing, that one of the things that we're starting to learn is that this is not a single direction education modality anymore. In other words, the social systems that we're studying within, say, ASU Online, and will do so in other adaptive courses, are interesting in that the points of interest and engagement that students get, and pedagogical data from traditional sources, textbooks, et cetera, but also actually intellectual property that they get from real-time discussions in synchronous environments are significantly adding to the engagement process, the persistent process, and these are all things that we're going to be testing at more rigor.
Okay. How do you measure engagement?
So there's a number of ways to measure engagement, and you could define engagement in a number of different ways. Obviously, it's a pretty nebulous term. So I think the way we would look at engagement would be, what's the level of persistent interaction that a student has with any kind of stimuli within a course, whether it's a static piece of material, whether it's a synchronous real-time group environment, right, whether it's offline touches, to how often they connect with their faculty member, what they do offline in terms of the behavior as well. So I think, all those things in terms of how you build the equation, or the regression analysis to figure out the formulaic way to say that that's good engagement or bad engagement, or this equals engagement. So,
one of the things about big data is that it tells you a lot more that you didn't know. I remember a presentation from somebody at Coursera some years ago talking about MOOCs, that in a seminar with 30 or 100 students, 2 or 3 students miss something. That's random error. When you get 10,000 students who miss something, even the percentage might be the same. All of a sudden, you have data to look at patterns and how that might change the way you design curriculum or a better understanding of student learning. How does that begin to play out in terms of the kinds of, for example, ASU, large numbers of students online, some consistency in an online course that you may not necessarily get in a traditional classroom course?
So I think it's different in that we're getting to, even with our current systems that have been around for 15 years, let alone adaptive systems, we have the ability to build in some degree of automation, right? So in your example, in terms of 10,000 students getting a question wrong, now the system can tell us that the item is actually flawed because there's a certain value or number of students that come in and get it wrong, and there's obviously mathematics happening in the background that says you got to do something different, either your instruction or your item.
There's still human factors, though. At one point, at the end of the day, it's still a faculty member, maybe not sit the sage on the stage, but carrying that forward in a way that it becomes useful to the faculty member. This is essentially design in one sense, as opposed to just mathematics.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's important to understand the deep learning science that is contained within a course, even in very, very successful online courses, and really get to a level of granularity where an individual faculty member can understand. This is what we're trying to do in the Action Lab, is get it sort of actionable and understandable that you can take that piece of research and have direct impact on how somebody makes a decision on how to change the course.
I want to circle back to the issue of entrepreneurship. You've been on the outside. Essentially, you have worked with firms that have tried to bring technology, resources, and services to colleges and universities. Now you are, again, due respect, the Senior Innovation Fellow. Are there more? Are there several fellows, or are you the fellow?
Well, I'm the fellow when it comes to research. I'm sure there's lots of other fellows that are doing other things, yeah.
What's it feel like to be on the inside? Are you seeing a different side of higher education than you saw when you were on the outside?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely different. You certainly don't get, when you're in the private sector, selling things and building things for the education market. You don't have the appreciation for the level of expertise that goes into the research that's going on in engineering or other parts of the area, and just how smart people are in terms of, you know, their caliber to teach and move people through a learning path. And so that's interesting. There are some things that move slow, obviously, but so far ASU is a unique situation, I think.
And to all the folks who are here as entrepreneurs, hoping to do well and do good in the education market, lots of showcasing of startups and all these, 2 or 3 words of wisdom, you know, where must attention be paid in terms of what they do in their efforts to help improve education, foster innovation? Yeah,
so I think that we typically look at building stuff, products and services, you know, in a vertical stovepipe. You know, we have one-off solutions for one-off problems. And I think that building to a greater network of existing enterprise technologies or developing products with product design and product strategy to try to break the cycle of a one-off implementation or a one-off product.
Great. Lou Pugliese, Lou, my friend, thanks very much for joining us today. I want to remind our audiences that these interviews will also be archived. We'll have them posted. We'll be sending out emails. You can access them after the conference. Lou, thanks again for joining us. Next up is Jacob Dayan, who is chairman of EdTech Israel. We'll be back in a moment. Lou, again, many thanks.
Thanks, Casey.